Hi, I'm Aaron Schneider. I'm the founding editor of the Thames Review and the author of one book so far, Grass-Fed, a novella. And I'm here to read a poem by Isabella Vallancy Crawford. In an earlier life, I studied and wrote on 19th century Canadian literature. And she's a 19th century Canadian poet and one who has been largely forgotten. She didn't have it particularly well off during her time either. She was born in Dublin and came to Canada at quite an early age. And her father was uh, kind of a get about and also dishonest. And she inherited some of that legacy in the sense that like he wasn't particularly welcomed by the communities in which he lived. And she wasn't either, although she wasn't dishonest in the way that he was. So she was socially quite a marginalized figure in Upper Canada and in Canada, and subsequently has been fairly marginal to Canadian literature. She's sometimes included with the Confederation poets, but given very much a kind of minimal role. And if you look at, anthologies or textbooks, you'll find that she's often given a nod, but only maybe one or two of her poems are included, where you'll get a dozen of poems from other writers like Charles G.D. Roberts or Archibald Lampman, who were her contemporaries. I find her particularly interesting because she's not really in lockstep with those writers. They are pretty conventional. They, evince a kind of late romanticism. They have pretty straightforward beliefs about colonialism and things like that. And she doesn't. She looks on the surface like one of them and like she's a pretty conventional writer, but she tends to write these poems that slide in these quiet but quite clever critiques of what she's writing about. So for example, I'm about to read to you a poem called Canada to England. It was published in 1874 in the Mail, which is the Toronto Mail. It's one of the newspapers, the other one being the Globe, that merged to form the Globe and Mail. And it's a very conventional kind of poem about the emergent nation. So 1874 is in the sort of decade right after Confederation. Canada is in some ways kind of coming into its own in the view of many of its citizens. It's maturing, and there's this sort of outpouring of a variety of poems that present the nation as vigorous and youthful and powerful, and can consider and kind of mediate its relationship to England. This is one of those poems. But what makes it interesting, and what I find really interesting about her, is that early on in this poem, if you pay attention, you'll notice that she talks about how Canada, because Canada was building the same resource extraction economy that we have today, was taming nature. And she represents nature as Samson yet unshorn. And what looks like a kind of celebration of really straightforward colonial resource extraction, and the kind of celebration you'd find in lots of other poems in the period, on further investigation gets a little bit more complicated. Because I obviously wasn't there, but I've heard that, if you take Samson and you shear his locks, bad things happen to your institutions. So there's at once this poem that looks like it's celebratory of the new nation and is also weirdly threatening and quietly and sharply critical of it. And that's why I like her. She writes poems that look conventional, but very quietly hide the kind of criticisms, in fact, that you would expect from a more marginal poet in these poems. And I also think it's really interesting that there is someone in the 19th century who is, even in this small, quiet way, producing critiques of the more conventional ideas, because honestly, it's hard to find writers like that in the 19th century in Canada. So without further ado, this is Isabella Vallancy's poem, Canada to England. As I said, it was first published in Toronto newspaper, The Mail, in 1874, and then it was republished in her book, Old Spooks Past and Other Poems. Old Spooks Past, Malcolm's Katie and Other Poems, in 1887, and then we published in 1905. So Canada to England. Actually, before I begin, I want to make one other caveat, and that is that I teach a lot of first-year creative writing courses, and I get a lot of students who, like me, when they were in high school, wrote really archaic-sounding poetry, and I try to break them of that and get them writing in a more contemporary voice, and a voice that sounds more like theirs as opposed to someone from the 19th century. If you happen to be one of those students and you have found your way to this video, you're about to see me read an old-fashioned kind of poem. My suggestion is that the next time you see me, you mock me mercilessly for doing this. I 100% endorse that and will support it. Okay, without further ado, Isabella Vallancy Crawford's Canada to England. Gone are the days, old warrior of the seas, when thine armed head bent low to catch my voice, caught but the plaintive sighings of my woods, in the wild roar of rocks dividing streams, and the loud bellow of my cataracts, bridged with the seven splendors of the bow, when nature was a Samson yet unshorn, filling the land with solitary might, or as the angel of the apocalypse, 1 foot upon the primeval bowered land, 1 foot upon the white mane of the sea, my voice but faintly swelled the ebb and flow of the wild tides and storms that beat upon thy rocky girdle, loud shrieking from the Ind ambrosial breathing furies, from the north thundering with arctic bellows, groans of seas rising from tombs of ice disrupted by the magic kisses of the wide-eyed sun. The times have won a change. Nature no more lords it alone and binds the lonely land a serf to tongueless solitudes. But nature's self is led glad captive in light fetters rich, as music sounding silver can adorn. And man has forged them, and our silent God behind his flaming world smiles on the deed. Man hath dominion, words of primal might. Man hath dominion, thus the words of God. If destiny is writ on night's dusk scroll, then youngest stars are dropping from the hand of the Creator sowing on the sky, my name in seeds of light. Ages will watch those seeds expand to sons, such as the tree bears on its boughs, which grows in paradise. How sounds my voice, my warrior kinsman, now? Sounds it not like to thine in lusty youth, a world-possessing shout of busy men, veined with the clang of trumpets and the noise of those who make them ready for the strife, and in the making ready bruise its head? Sounds it not like thine, the whispering vine, the robe of summer rustling through the fields, the glowing of the cattle in the meads, the sound of commerce and the music set, flame-brightened step of art in stately halls, all the infinity of notes which chord the diapason of a nation's voice? My infant's tongues lisp word for word with thine. We worship, wed, and die, and God is named, that way ye name him. Strong bond between two mighty lands, when as one mingled cry, as of one voice, Jehovah turns to hear. The bonds between us are no subtle links, of subtle minds binding in close embrace, half struggling for release, to alien lands, but God's own seal of kindred, which to burst were but to dash his benediction from our brows. Who loveth not his kin, whose face and voice are his, how shall we love whom God he hath not seen? Anyway, thank you for listening to that and for indulging my belated but still present interest in 19th century Canadian literature. And if you do find something that you like in this, I would recommend a few other poems by her. The long poem Malcolm's Katie is fascinating. The City Tree is also pretty good, and there's a variety of other things you can seek out and find. She's got a poem about Esther, actually, that's really fascinating. Hopefully that maybe has piqued your interest in her, because she's taught a little bit by academics, but largely forgotten, and it's a bit of a shame. So thank you for listening.